Today I was thinking about a discussion topic about training around injuries. I know we have a lot of athletes that come in and they get hurt within their sport. What do y'all think about training around injuries? How do y'all do it? How do y'all handle your athletes? How do you keep them in the gym when they're hurt in certain areas? What do y'all think? Let's go first.
I usually start with depending on what the injury is. So if it's something that they're actually working with a physical therapist on, it's something more serious than say it's to the left knee. What the injury is, I'm assuming that physical therapist, especially if I can talk to them, is basically training that knee effectively as much as it can handle. We might not think of it as training, but the rehab is as much as that can take. And I'm gonna somewhat ignore that side in our training. Maybe there's certain things that can help, whether it's mobility work, soft tissue, depends on the injury, it might do that. From a training standpoint, I'm gonna look elsewhere to pick up the volume that we couldn't get with exercises that would have come into play with.
Yeah, I agree with that for sure. Being in contact with a PT or a doctor is always key. I look at it as an opportunity. A lot of times people look at it as injuries like, oh, it's the end all be all, or this is terrible. It can be for that athlete, but I look at it as an opportunity to train weaknesses. Why did it happen in the first place? Or maybe they have a glaring upper body weakness, but they hurt their lower body, so now we can really focus on that without them thinking that we have to take complete training, because we're trying to find different factors and put it all together. But if their lower body can't be trained for 3 months, that's a perfect timetable for us to say, you know what, this is bad, but let's make your upper body or other weakness, core strength or something like that, now a strength and not a weakness. Look at it as an opportunity as well for athletes.
I think that's important from personal experience than just from like a sport psych side. Being hurt and you can't practice with the team, can't play in games can be pretty demoralizing. Yeah. So phrasing it in that way, like you said, if we're going to train weaknesses, you're going to come out of this better.
Right.
It's a more positive spin, but also you can actually keep training. Be in the weight room with the rest of the team if you're not doing the same workout and be involved and still feel like you're part of it.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I'm one of the first things that I'm always looking to do and try to really hammer home is that an injury is not an excuse to stop training. Look for a plan B or C or whatever it is to keep training as much as you can and replicate what the ideal case scenario would be, whether that is coming as close to maintaining volume or maybe even exceeding normal volumes, or training the weak side, as you say, or weak areas, as Drake pointed out. And I think it's actually possible to come out the other side from an injury fitter, faster, stronger, that kind of thing, especially with team sport athletes that are maybe in season. It's really common for us here to have a team sport athlete get injured and not be able to play their sport, but be able to spend more significant time with us because of the controlled environment that we work in. Is a little more predictable, a little less chaotic, a little more fitness-based rather than sport-based. It's pretty easy in a relatively short period of time to get someone fitter with concentrated fitness work than they would if they had to split their time between fitness work and more dedicated sport work. So, you can get a guy in relatively short period of time with some injuries to return to play far fitter than they were before they got injured. And I think that's a good selling point. It's a big mistake, I think, on a lot of coaches and athletes' parts to basically just use the injury as an excuse to stop training or to let things slide. And when in fact you could use that to your advantage. The other athletes don't necessarily have the opportunity to put in that dedicated fitness work or get stronger in a weak area or whatever it is, because they have to do the ball work or the technical work or whatever. But now we can spend that extra resources to just work on fitness and strength and whatever it is.
Yeah, I think it's a key point, especially if you're dealing with, I guess not really pro athletes, but all types of athletes. Their seasons are very short, so if you have a high school level athlete that has a injury, they're trying to go play college, if they completely stop, say it's an ACL injury, that's a long time for them to not train. If they're like, well, I can't train till my knee's better. Well, they've just lost not only the time that they lost in sport, they also lost training. They might never get back to where they needed to get to make a college, to get that Division I offer. Or if you're a pro athlete, you lose a year, the NFL, pro soccer, MLS, any of those teams, they're very quick to find a player that's ready to play. So if you lose a year of training, I think it's dumb on your part to say, I can't train, because all you're going to do is lose your spot. You're going to lose your contract. If you lose a whole year and then another year and a half of training, you should look at it as an opportunity to say, I got to get better at these things. I'm not afforded this time just to sit here and not train, because on the other end, whenever I am back, I may not be the same person because I took so much time off. And sports are very quick. I mean, if you lose 2 years of training and playing, you may not come back and may not get another opportunity like you have at this point. So I think it's really dangerous to really stop training completely just because of an injury to one spot of your body, unless it's like some major things you have to get that. But most times we can train around anything for the most part.
Somewhat knock on wood here, I've been lucky this year. None of my athletes I've trained have had a major injury such as an ACL tear that would have that. More commonly, I'll see things pop up like quad tendonitis. I've got a track and field athlete, and also he's playing soccer. After their soccer tryouts, it was a pretty brutal couple of days for his high school team. He's coming in and his knee's bothering him on that. He's had quad tendonitis before he knows what it is there, and so that's something that I probably more commonly see. And then training around that is been something that I'll see more often and not have that much trouble with. So that particular day, we were slated to do squats and switch that to an RDL. So that was an advantage or a situation where we could still get a big strength stimulus, make it a little bit more hip dominant, and it took some of the stress off the quad itself, and he was able to still handle that session, get what we wanted out of it, even if it wasn't the exact way I planned. Do you guys see any contexts like that frequently, and maybe some common substitutions you might make?
Yeah, I mean, I had one when I was training a hockey player. They're always on the ice, a little different. The impact of sprinting, when we started sprint training with them, they actually they started to get shin splints because they just weren't ready for the volume and the impact. So we had to talk to them and try to figure out. They wanted at first, they were like, we need to just completely stop all impact activities. And so we pulled it back, but we had to get creative and figure out different ways, like on the rower or the machines that take out a lot of impact forces, but they can still push a lot of force to try to get that power output. I see you just have to get creative a lot of times with those different injuries. Like you said, you did an RDO instead of a squat because you have tendonitis, but you're still going to get a huge strength stimulus. I think getting creative with those common injuries is key, because as a coach, they kind of keep you on your toes. You have someone coming, they're going to get injured, but it gets you at the outside, thinking outside that box of, I'm just going to squat heavy and sprint. Well, it's like, we got to figure out the same stimulus, but how do we get it achieved with these small nagging injuries so they don't turn in, a quad tendonitis doesn't turn into a quad rupture or things down the road, but you still have to keep training them. I think that's a key point, is being creative and getting kind of outside the box thinking.
I think you want to keep it as close as possible to plan A. And then it just comes down to what was plan A, and then what is the injury, how does it limit your ability to do plan A, whether that's changing the exercise selection or changing the focus from lower body to upper body in the weight room, or moving away from a specific loading pattern, as Drake said, say going from impact to non-impact, or maybe the person can't handle high eccentrics, so you have to go to isometric, or maybe it's tendonitis, or so you have to go to hip extension dominant type movements rather than something that might stress patella tendon. So yeah, as close as you can get, and then you get creative and try to figure out equivalencies of volumes and intensities. Some things don't match really well in terms of finding equivalencies. It's really hard to say match the intensity of a rowing piece to, say, sprinting. But if your only option is to do rowing because the person maybe has a stress fracture or something like that, then you use the rower, use the bike. Well, how do we start to marry or match the intensities with our substitution with what we had actually planned? Time frames are one, intent is another thing. So we basically go with the same intent. If we're sprinting, obviously the intent is quite high. Time frames are going to be under 6 seconds or so, so your reps should be about 6 seconds or less if we're trying to put that on the rower or the bike or wherever. We then have to make sure that the intent is real high and that the rest and recovery is sufficient. With some of these activities, we're going to have to look at things like volume equivalencies, and in certain ones, especially when we're trying to sub out shock loading or high impact loading with a lesser impact loading activity, say going onto a bike or rower or even going into a pool, I think you need to significantly increase the volume. My general rule of thumb is to use the same time frames, intensities and so forth, but do as much as 50%, maybe double the total volume. So if I had perhaps something like 8 times 30 meters planned, 8 times 30 meter sprints, that's roughly 8 times 4 or 5 seconds of high intensity effort. I might do as much as 16 of those bouts on a bike or a rower, still keep the duration as short, about 4 or 5 seconds. If we were on a bike, maybe a little bit longer if we were on a rower, because the rower has intermittent built-in rest already in there. Every time you recycle on the stroke, there's a little bit of a rest period where we can recover slightly. So I'm trying to match that, and if I can, or if I need to, I'll increase the volumes, because again, we're taking out a lot of things a lot of times, whether it's their sport practice or the plan A options. So how can we not only fill in the gaps, but maybe do a little bit extra? And I use the guideline of about 50 to 100 extra percent in terms of volume loading, if I am able to match intensities.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, if you're taking out impact forces, I mean, you have to kind of think about it. If that's part of our program and for Plan A, you have to be smart with, all right, I still need to get the same stimulus, trying to get as close as I can, like you said, the same stimulus. So a lot of people don't think about the volume aspect. They're like, well, I want to do 6 sprints. I'm going to do 6 sprints on the bike, not taking into account how hard on the body, the eccentric force, the impact forces from sprinting for 6 reps compared to a bike, which you are mainly pushing through without the eccentric forces as much. So adding in that volume by double is a really smart piece. What do y'all think about if you have a single side that's injured, say you hurt your right shoulder, do you train the left side? Do you completely take it out? I know asymmetries are a big thing. We don't want to cause another injury down the road. But I've seen some research where saying as long as like more of the neural pathways, if we're training the arms, there's some they're kind of still correlated together. The pathways are still there, so it's completely stopping, I think, is bad. But at the same time, you have to kind of play it. You have to figure out the smart balance between the two, so you don't completely lose all the muscle mass and all the strength gains that you made on the upper body. But what do y'all think about training the non-injured side when the injured side is kind of hindrance at that point?
I absolutely train the non-injured side for that same exact reason. You're at minimum going to maintain what you have on that non-injured side, which would be good, but you're potentially going to improve there. And like I said earlier, say it's the right side that's injured. If you're working with a physical therapist, that right side isn't necessarily just doing nothing. Potentially, it's going to actually still be trained to the limit of what it can be. And in a little bit more advanced stage of that rehab process, the better you as a strength coach can understand that specific injury, the more you can then see what exercises are going to still be appropriate and what you can start picking up that volume again. I haven't seen it get to the point when you create a massive asymmetry out of a cartoon where you've got a giant left arm and just a bone on the right side.
Yeah.
I've never been afraid of that happening after seeing some research you were talking about. I first was introduced to that in 2012 when I was at Boyles for the summer there. We talked about that when we had a girl coming in with an ACL injury, still doing single leg deadlifts on the other side, still doing single leg squats, getting the training stimulus where they could.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think it's, like you said, having this cartoon character, having like one big arm and one small arm, it really doesn't happen. I think you just have to be smart. Like if you're dealing with us as coaches, we can kind of control those factors. But sometimes athletes will take it upon themselves to, all right, well, if I can just keep training hard, and they may just grab the biggest dumbbell and just maybe push to that extra limit, be like, all right, well, we're still trying to gain it, but not to the point where you're just trying to make one arm bigger or one side stronger than the other. But definitely smart to keep training both sides and not completely stop the other side just because you have an injury.
Even say in a healthy athlete, asymmetries in sport are normal, common, and possibly even advantageous. So say you are a right-handed pitcher. It's probably a lot more likely for you to get a right side injury when we're talking about shoulder or elbow or even like towards the scapular, the whole shoulder complex there.
Right.
So potentially this is now a situation you can start to actually bring yourself a little bit back towards the middle. That left side doesn't get that throwing volume. We can pick up some extra there and get to the point where the asymmetry isn't necessarily as glaring.
For sure. I think most sports you have, in soccer you have one dominant leg. I'm sure that plant leg might have different forces that it can control better than the other, that can coordination with the right and the left side. You have throwing athletes from javelin, to overhead tennis movement. I think you're gonna have asymmetry. So I think when there is an injury, a lot of times people are like, well, I completely stopped, and it's like, no, you might actually can keep that coordination and actually improve the opposite side to now that you don't have an asymmetry, you might be even more balanced after the injury, which some people might find that's crazy, but the fact that they don't think of how much more volume if you are right-handed, that you kind of just naturally go to your right hand, or if your plant leg is the same plant leg and you have the injury, and now can train the other side a little bit differently. So it is interesting to see for sure how the body works that way.
I look to train non-affected side as well. I think there are some considerations you have to take into account, but I think it needs to be done. I think you get about 20% crossover between limbs. I think if you train a non-affected side, we should get some crossover effect onto the affected side. What I am more concerned about is, say, becoming a hermit crab and having one gigantic arm and one little tiny arm, is less the limbs but more the postural muscles and the spinal alignment. Because if all you're doing is holding weight on one side, then you can very quickly develop trunk imbalance, and I think that's where things can go awry a little bit. So you have to train that a little bit. I recently had a SI joint flare up that kind of held me out of training for quite a while, really affected the right side, and I was unable to do a lot of my normal training, kind of weightlifting, squatting, that kind of thing, and did a lot of left lower back stabilization type training, and it's actually brought that side up quite a bit to where I'm totally pain-free now. I have a tendency to be hypertonic and have greater hypertrophy on my right lumbar area, and I was able to, due to what it was effectively forced rest from my normal training, to spend some time remediating the other side. Asymmetry isn't bad until asymmetry becomes bad, and then when it gets outside of that acceptable bandwidth, then that's where I think it becomes a concern, because then it can kind of take over, so to speak. If it takes over, then it's only going to get exacerbated even more. So I'd be train the affected side, watch for how it impacts postural alignment and that kind of thing. If you can, start to do more isolation type activities, perhaps, to eliminate that, or look for exercises that can help offset it. So instead of doing just all single leg squats, holding in a front rack or something like that, maybe consider doing leg extensions and leg curls, because then you don't get that trunk asymmetry that you might otherwise cause problems down the road. Another thing I found useful in injuries in my past and with athletes is to use EMS. Basically, use some electrical stimulation that'll help preserve hypertrophy at the very least in the affected side. And if we can preserve muscle mass, cross-sectional area, that's the groundwork for keeping strength. You get the neurological side with that 20% crossover by training the non-affected side, and then you can maintain muscle mass without having to actually move the affected limb, using either isometric contractions or electrical stimulation. So look for any possibility that you have to hold on to whatever you have in the affected side, and then train around it.
Yeah, it's key. Working at a PT clinic for a few years, That was one of the big things. Coming off of surgery, the muscle just couldn't turn on, so they would put on E-stim units, and it would fire to try to keep as much quadricep or whatever muscle we were trying to fire with that unit, to keep that same muscle mass, to try to hold on to it. But I think you bring up a key point with postural alignments and things like that. A lot of times I see athletes, if they have an ankle sprain, they don't realize how up the chain it affects your knee alignment into the hip, into the back. And so if you might have an ankle issue, but then the postural alignment is very key for sure.
Yeah, when I hurt my ankle or my foot recently, and was on crutches for 6 months, and one of the things that ended up happening is that as I stood on the one leg and coached on one leg for several hours a day, was that the back pain was actually worse than the ankle pain or the foot pain.
Yeah.
If you're forced to move into unilateral asymmetrical stance, especially if you're forced to stand on that one leg all the time or use crutches all the time, that can really screw you up. I ended up having to get regular acupressure and acupuncture on the back, basically on the opposite side, because of these weird loading patterns that I wasn't used to and that I wouldn't want to return to once the leg was fine.
I think quite often the site of the pain is not the source in that case. So it was a little over 2 years ago now, had a pole vaulting accident, badly hurt my left ankle. It wasn't a break, but a pretty severe sprain. And even once the ankle was at a point where rehab was considered over, I would still get referred pain potentially either in the Achilles or up chain to the hip, because that ankle was not stable yet. And it's taken a long time for that last bit to finally heal up to the point where there was no hesitation, there was nothing that was holding back there. It's a little bit of a tangent from where we're getting on today, but it comes back to understanding the injury that you're dealing with and how you can still train around it. So some of this is general recommendations, but a lot of it does come down to the specifics of the athlete and the injury.
For sure. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of factors that go into it. I know everybody's like, well, what about that one injury? But the one injury has a lot of things that come into play. The body doesn't work it works with synergy. So if that ankle's hurt, so something else is kind of going up chain, you have to kind of keep that in mind, as well as training around the injury, is being smart with all your recommendations, not leaving things out. I think it just comes down to communication with the athlete, how they're feeling, and making sure they understand that it's important that us as coaches, we've been through injuries and we kind of understand how to get around them, and it's very important for us to keep working with that athlete so they don't lose anything that they've already gained, and we can actually still come out the other side even faster, stronger, and more powerful, even though we do have an injury. It's still a key component to this for sure.